Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to wait for a couple of minutes before starting to make sure people are joining us for this great webinar. We'll start in a minute. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar on Unify endpoint and network telemetry for any SIEM. Today, it's a joint webinar with Cribl and Corelight. We'll do a bit of housekeeping before we start. So obviously the webinar is being recorded and will be available later on. If you have any question, please use the chat button to ask your questions, and the question will be answered at the end of the webinar. So today we have Matt Ellison and George Mehej. So Matt is from Corelight. Matt has specialized in cybersecurity over 15 years across endpoint, network, and user technology, and has led teams in production, in product management, product marketing, and technical sales. With previous roles at Symantec, Logarithm, and BAE Systems, Matt's extensive experience has allowed him to work with numerous organizations across EMEA and APAC, helping them understand how best to address their security challenges. Our guest speaker, George Mehej, is Solution Engineering Manager for Emerging Manager at Cribl. George has worked with leading organizations in emerging markets to solve security and data problems. George has extensive experience in the cybersecurity, observability, and data space. In previous roles, he has worked at Immerse Labs as head of Alliance and Splunk as head of the sales engineering team for many years. So with this, I'll leave you with our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Virginie. That's great. So hi to everyone on the webinar. Great to have you with us today. I'll actually turn off my webcam so you don't have to put up with my distracting face. And we can get straight into the, back to the screen. Yeah, we can get straight into the presentation. So I'll just start by talking briefly about Corelight, if you haven't worked with Corelight previously. So we are at the moment the fastest growing network and detection response company. We grew roughly 40% last year. There's been numerous reports that NDR is now the #1 security solution spend for organizations. So whilst we've been around a long time, we were founded by the original creators of Zeek, or formerly known as Bro. Our open NDR approach is very important to us. We kind of partially exist to make sure that the open source Zeek has always been available, but that's almost 30 years old now. So this network security monitoring has been going a long time. We are absolutely the tool of choice for what we describe as elite defenders. So if you call out CrowdStrike or Mandiant to do an incident response, then they will exclusively use Corelight as their network detection response tool. We are the embedded technology in Microsoft Defender endpoints. So they actually rewrote the Defender for Endpoint tool so that their network capture at that endpoint was in the Zeek format, so that it would immediately integrate with Zeek Network. And we are also used as the NDR tool of choice for all of the Black Hat network operation centers as those events happen around the world. So yeah. That is Corelight. So George, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Hi, everyone. George Merhajir from Cribl. Just a quick snapshot about Cribl as a company before we dig into the technology and the technical details on the use case. So Cribl is a company that was founded in 2017. We're also a fast, very rapidly growing company that is actually known today as the company that has defined what the market calls the observability pipeline. So what we basically do is we provide an agnostic data pipeline technology that typically helps organizations across different sectors to solve challenges that are the result of the data growth, which are mainly complexity and cost specifically. So, of course, when we talk complexity and cost of the data and the growth of the data, pretty much every organization today is suffering from these challenges. So that's why we've seen a lot of companies across the different sectors adopting our technology. We have also alliances with security vendors specifically, like Corelight, of course, which we're going to see today in details, but also CrowdStrike, namely, is using our technology actually to define the pipeline ingestion, and it's actually called the CrowdStream under CrowdStrike product portfolio.
Brilliant. Thanks, George. So yeah, let's move ahead and talk about what we are going to be looking at today. So the discussion today, as you've probably gathered from the title, is about how we can tie together endpoints and network data. Now, I'm sure we've all been very much aware of the press and the marketing around XDR and the concept of bringing together that endpoint and network data into a single interface. Or alternatively, one of the other concepts that's been discussed is the SOC triad, as originally proposed by Gartner. But that concept of network data plus endpoint data being brought together in a SIEM, a source system, or some kind of other tool to allow analysts to pivot between the two and get much richer insights into what they're seeing. When you get one of those alerts from either point, being able to add in that extra data and get more information. So we are going to talk about the concepts that we're looking at there, and what that will lead to in terms of how Corelight and Cribl works together. I'll then hand over to George, and George will talk in a lot more detail around Cribl and how all of that works in being able to assist with achieving that goal of bringing together the endpoint and the network data. And then we'll have kind of a walkthrough / demonstration. So it's not going to be a live demonstration, but it's a walkthrough of a system that we put together, Corelight and Cribl, to prove the concept of how we can actually utilize Cribl to provide a much more functional solution than your traditional just bringing together network and endpoint data in the SIEM and having to pivot based on time and IP address and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's the agenda for this morning. Okay, so when you are working with your security operations center, or you're in your security operations center and you have those kind of alerts and things coming in, things are very different from how they used to be. We've all been through that concept of you have your firewalls in place, and that used to be the big thing that people spent money on around building this sort of defensive perimeter around the edge of the network and trying to stop everybody coming in. And then we switched more to the sort of, as when I worked at Logarithm, the as we used to call it, they will get in. That concept of trying to do that asymmetrical warfare, where the attackers just need to find one tiny hole to get into your organization, but you have to defend hundreds of different holes. That just doesn't work. So it's actually much better to work on the basis that, do you know what, the attackers probably will get in at some point. So we need to be monitoring our network internally and looking for those indicators of compromise, or indicators of concern, as they're also called, where we're actually kind of seeing the attackers within the network, and we can respond accordingly. And the richer the data, the more likely we are to find them earlier in the kill chain when they've only just made their initial compromises, rather than at the end of the kill chain when they've actually breached. But that brings a huge set of challenges. For most organizations, that means they have an alert-based strategy. So a tool is deployed within the network and at the endpoint, and when stuff happens, that generates alerts. Now, obviously, one of the big challenges there, as anybody that's worked with a SOC or as an analyst will know, it's that alert volume. It can very quickly accelerate, especially if you're looking for things that are early indicators like scanning and lateral movement. They can be completely innocuous within an internal network, or they can be a threat. And unfortunately, in most cases, they do have to be investigated. So people look for other ways of doing that, managing the alert volume through automation, for example. Hey, if it's from this machine to this machine and we've not seen any other connected alerts, then we're okay to close that and go ahead. Or we tune, so we tune down so we don't get so many alerts, but that of course runs the risk of missing something. But trying to find that balance with an alert-based strategy can be difficult. So Corelight tries to take a different approach. I should say this isn't our own approach. This isn't something that we kind of just dreamt up, but this is from something that we've pulled together from working with the elite defenders that have deployed Zeek historically. So predating the existence of Corelight, when Zeek was just an open source tool, there are a large number of very large government organizations, commercial organizations that use Zeek to collect evidence from their network and to understand what's going on. Now, they don't take an alert-based approach typically. Of course, it forms part of their approach, but more often they will take an evidence-based strategy. So they will come up with a thesis, they will think about a particular device within their network, and how the normal behavior for that device would look, and the kind of things that might indicate something that's untoward. So they will build those theses, they'll do their threat hunting, they will turn those threat hunts into automated searches, all kinds of different ways of doing it. But again, just to tie back, one of the reasons where we talk about the fact that Mandiant and CrowdStrike utilize Corelight for their instant response is for that acceleration. So we don't need to go into it now, but there's numerous examples of threats that were not discovered by the traditional kind of tools because they were supply chain attacks. So the device at the endpoint, the software at the endpoint looked perfectly normal, but the behaviors of the network traffic were definitely not normal. And for that, you need to look at that network evidence. So that breadth of evidence, that ability to understand exactly what's going on in the network is very useful and very valuable, but can be challenging to pull together those two different bits and pieces. So moving ahead with that, this is the kind of approach that we see from our Corelight customers. So on the left-hand side there, we have all the different environments where we collect data from, whether that's cloud, whether it's on-premise. We have the different type of network sensors, so physical, virtual, software, cloud, and they pull in all of that information. So initially we have those alerts and metadata. So all of the metadata is where we're stripping all of the information out of the header packets, and that includes things like for encrypted packets around the certificates, all kinds of different bits and pieces, and we tie together those network streams. Two options of what we can do there. We have our investigator tool, which offers an initial GUI where customers can go in and very quickly understand what's happening. And then we can also put our data straight towards a tool like Cribl, where we get all of the extra benefits that George is going to talk about shortly. And then all of that functional data then can go into your SIEM, your XDR solution, or indeed your data lake. And then a couple of other things that we can do. We can extract files from clear text network streams and store those somewhere for you, so you can see those. And we can also capture packets. Now, we don't just do a straightforward PCAP. We have a smart packet capture where you actually capture packets that have been triggered based on an alert or based on a certain type of traffic or based on communication to a certain IP address with a certain protocol, all kinds of different triggers that we can use there to initiate those packet captures. But it just means that rather than having a few days worth of packet captures circling around, you can get weeks or months of packet captures relevant to the important stuff and not just collecting everything because that's the only option. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to George. So George, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So a quick intro about Cribl Stream, which is our flagship product. What I'm going to talk about now, as you will see on this slide, as well as the upcoming few slides, is Cribl Stream specifically, and then I'll explain the whole portfolio and how we fit this together. So Cribl Stream is actually a technology, as I mentioned before, is an agnostic data pipeline technology that sits between, as you see here, what you see here in the green is actually the Cribl Stream technology, and it practically sits between sources and destinations. Sources are the data sources that we collect from, so we take the ownership of collecting data from, different sources that you want to analyze, and then basically what we do is that we take this data through different protocols, different agents, different ways of push and pull mechanisms, etc., etc. But then when we collect, we transform this data, right? We will see on the next slide many use cases on how we transform the data and why. But effectively, once we transform this data, we reduce this data, we enrich it, etc., we then have to route it into destinations. So the destinations here are the analytics solutions, are the data lakes, are the object storage solutions, depending on where we want to put the data. And as you can see here, we support, of course, this is just a snapshot or an example of technologies that we integrate with. Now, since we're with Corelight today, Corelight is one of the most common or widely used, of course, technology, and it's a very it's naturally a common data source that we deal with because it's very volumetric. It provides a lot of insights, and it can be coupled, as we will see in the demo, with like the EDR data and the endpoint telemetry. Now, one thing before I move into the next slide, you see here the data lake. So the data lake is not offered by Cribl, is not a Cribl technology, but basically remember what we do is that we route the data after transforming it or passing it through into analytics solutions. But what we also facilitate is basically being able to effectively use a data lake technology, an object storage to store the compliance data, to store the long-term data that you want for many years, while of course, to realize basically the benefit of reducing the cost, because this is one of our missions, to reduce the cost and of course the complexity. So if we take ownership of the data collection and we route it into one or multiple destinations, what we basically gonna do is, on the next slide, Matt, please. Yeah, so the use cases are here. Basically, as I mentioned before, we reduce the data, right? We want to reduce cost, we want to remove the noise, we want to maybe ship data or route data into lower cost analytics systems or storage systems, depending on the use case and the data. So we reduce the data through different ways, through functions that we do with pipelines, and hence why we call the technology a data pipeline technology, because all the transformation is happening on the pipelines. But also we enrich the data. We enrich it through different ways and from different lookups, locations, databases, threat intelligence feeds, etc. And that happens, remember, on the fly. So as the data is streaming in real time, we are actually enriching this data before we send it into its destination. So before you index it and store this data in your analytics solution or storage, basically we are enriching this data. The same thing happens for the masking, etc., etc. But the other thing that we do, obviously, after we, like enrich the data, reduce it, we transform this data as well. And the reason why we reshape the data if we want is to actually fit, to make it fit actually into the analytics solution. So say, for example, today you're using a SIEM solution from, like vendor X, like Elastic, for example, and tomorrow you added another solution like Splunk or Exabeam. You can actually now, without going back into the source and without doing sometimes a very lengthy exercise and changes and so on, you can now fork another copy of the data into your new SIEM. And more importantly, with the format that this new SIEM or new log management solution is expecting it to be. So that really gives you a lot of efficiency. Think about it when you want to migrate from one SIEM to another. Think about when you want to send data that is in the cloud to send it into a cheaper or lower cost, like object storage, etc., etc. So we facilitate all of that. And that actually opens the last point for me, which is the replay that you saw on the previous picture when I mentioned the data lake. So basically what we do is that we send this data into a data lake. So say, for example, we trimmed the data, we reduced it, we filtered out the noise, we cleaned white spaces, we aggregated data. But in some cases you say, you know what, I don't want to lose the high fidelity, raw copy of the data. That's one. So basically what we do is that we take this data and then we store it into your object storage, your S3 buckets, etc., etc., etc. But more importantly is the way we store this data. So we store it as is when it comes to its raw format. But what's really important is the ability to search this data and bring it back into a SIEM. So say, for example, today you stored firewall data or Corelight data for like 2 years, and then after 2 years, you decided to change into a new SIEM technology. We all know that bringing back historical data, especially when you change your analytics solution, is kind of a really very difficult exercise to do, and it's not risk-free. So what you typically do here with Cribl is basically we store this data in the S3 bucket. It's in its free original version. And then after 2 years, basically, I can bring back this data through Cribl, format it into the new format that this new SIEM or log management solution wants, and then send it to it. And then I can do my threat hunting, my audit use cases, and so on. So that's really a big part of what we do today to reduce cost and also to reduce the complexity and to enhance the performance in many cases of the analytics solutions and so on. And to tie it into, next slide, please, Matt, on the Corelight thing. So how do we translate this into what we're talking about today? So if you look with me at the top of the screen on this picture, this is a snapshot from Cribl Stream technology. So what we're typically doing here is, if you see on the left of the screen, the sources, Elastic API, which means the beats agents. You see syslog data coming from firewalls. You see, like data coming from Corelight sensors specifically, and we're collecting also, Windows endpoint data through the Windows event forwarder mechanism in this case. So basically, what we're doing here, if you focus on the bottom side of the left, the bottom of the left side of the screen, so you see the Corelight sensors sending multiple copies of the data. So you see a copy that is going from a Corelight sensors up into an Amazon S3 bucket or a data lake. And then you see another copy going into maybe an Elastic cluster and another copy going into Splunk indexers. And what I want to focus here is on this part. The data that is going into Splunk, what we're doing with it is that you see here, this widget here is basically we're applying a set of pipelines, and luckily enough, we have this Cribl pack for Corelight that does these things for you. So as you can see here on the bottom of the screen now, I am with a ready-made Cribl pack for Corelight data for the different types of data telemetry that's collected by Corelight. I can actually go and parse this data, trim this data, reduce it, enrich it, and then basically send it into one or more of the SIEM solutions that we have here. So you see here we have Splunk. Of course, they're all enabled, but we can enable one or two of them, generally depending on what you have. And then basically we format this data. So see, we make this data compliant with the data models that you have on your SIEM solution. And then basically, again, if we tie it back to the added value when it comes to the changes that may happen in the future in your environment, on your analytics solutions, you don't have anymore to go back and re-engineer this data to make it fit into the new technology. So this pack is available. We're going to share after this webinar, we're going to share the link with a blog and the link into the pack that you can use it for the technologies that you see here, like Microsoft Sentinel and Splunk, Elastic, Chronicle, and AWS Security Lake. Moving into my next slide on this section, basically, so I go back, I'm coming back now to this slide that you saw before, and I just want to iterate that what you've seen here so far is Cribl Stream. So Cribl Stream is a technology that I mentioned. It's the main, if you want, flagship technology that that will transform, collect, and route the data into the destinations. But what you see here as well, and if you go to our collateral or website, you're going to see Cribl Edge and Cribl Search. I intentionally didn't talk about them today in details because I wanted to focus on the core of you know, what we do in this streaming part along with Corelight. But just so you know, Cribl Edge is effectively an agent that sits on Windows and Linux servers, and it does the collection, provided you don't want to use your own agent or any other type of collection for the servers. So Cribl Edge is managed by the same instance that manages Cribl Stream, but it's basically an agent that sits there, and it can do transformations as well on the data as it sits on the edge. The other part is Cribl Search, or the other product, if you want, is Cribl Search. Cribl Search is a SaaS-based solution, unlike Cribl Stream and Cribl Edge, where basically you can have today Cribl Stream in on-premises fully, or you can have it in the cloud fully in our SaaS, or you can have it hybrid because you want to collect from different countries and different cloud providers, etc., etc. However, Cribl Search is an analytics solution. Hence why I note here, do we do analytics or we do streaming? Where do we focus? So our Cribl Search product is basically an analytics solution that is SaaS only provided. And what it does really, it analyzes the data. So it searches the data, obviously, and you know, represents it and analyzes it where it resides, which means if I send today data into S3 buckets, or I sent them into a blob storage, or I sent them into AWS Security Lake, I can analyze them from one single view while keeping the data there without shipping it into analytics solution. I'm not going to talk a lot about Cribl Search today, obviously, but we're going to use Cribl Search in the demo and the walkthrough because Cribl Search gives us this analytics piece. So consider today in the demo that this is the SIEM that we're using, but obviously you can apply the same use cases on the Corelight data and the enrichment that we've done with Cribl Stream. You can apply it into Splunk, Elastic, Exabeam, and all the SIEM and log management solutions that you have today in the market. Moving back to you, Matt.
Brilliant. Thanks, George. That was fantastic. So let's move on and explore how all of this ties together. So obviously we're here to talk about how we use Cribl to bring together those different pieces of information, and indeed how we actually enrich that, and that's going to be the really important thing. So when we talk about endpoint detection and response, there's obviously a number of different aspects to that, and you can see there the logos for the kind of well-known endpoints that we see out there. But there's other ways of doing it. You can take the Windows event logs. There's a ton of information in there, and in essence, that's often where the endpoints are pulling from anyway. They're built in. You get logs from both the operating system and applications, and then you get the different levels. We get errors, warnings, and information. Now that list there on the right, the Sneaky 6, you will probably recognize. So that's from MITRE, and that's 6 things that you should always be monitoring at the endpoint, because they can be indicative of stuff that's going on in the background that sort of looks and sounds pretty normal, but can be a serious indicator of something bad happening. So they're all pretty obvious. Obviously, new processes, new services being installed, accounts logging in, shares being accessed, a new service starting, and the one there that we're going to be highlighting today is a network connection by a particular process. So this is where something on an endpoint is initiating a network connection. Nothing smarter than that, pretty straightforward, but it's one of those 6 that we should be always looking at. Now, to do this, rather than use an actual endpoint tool, we used Sysmon in this environment. So a couple of reasons, well, actually 6 reasons, as you can see there. It's a Windows system service. It's a device driver. It's reboot persistent. It both monitors and logs everything that's going on. It's free because it's included with the operating system, and it's been around a long time. It's been well proven, and in fact there are lots of blogs and webinars and all kinds of things on how to do really good system monitoring with Sysmon, and get all of that information out and use it in a security environment. And in fact, as you can see there, Cribl actually has a webinar on how to use Cribl Stream to get better Sysmon data. So I recommend that you look that up, and that's another one that you can watch online, but some really good stuff in there. So using that as our kind of endpoint replacement, as it were, we built a test environment. And this was a combination of devices to provide that endpoint data, and then that was processed by Cribl, and then we forwarded it on. Excuse me. So we used a combination of Windows event forwarding and Sysmon, as mentioned. We only ran it for 5 days. It was just a small test environment, but it still has a pretty big impact. So there was no tuning really with any of this, only a small amount. If we move ahead, when you initially look at all of that stuff, it's a bit like looking at the Matrix. So unless you're Neo, you're stuck. You just see all of this huge amount of data, and it can be incredibly difficult to know what to do with it and how to work through it. So in this situation, we were running that combination of generating this endpoint data. So Windows event forwarding, even just within those 5 days and a handful of endpoints, we were looking at 5 million logs. And obviously that's constantly increasing. So outputs from PowerShell, Task Scheduler, Windows instrumentation, security logs, system logs, all kinds of stuff coming through from there. Sysmon, we actually focused just on the type 3 alerts, that's network. That reduced the Sysmon logging by about 25%, but still all of that was flowing into Cribl along with the Corelight data for everything that was happening on the network. But again, just to reiterate, this could be any endpoint solution. Cribl will take those feeds from CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, Windows Endpoint, all of the kind of different tools, sorry, Windows Defender for Endpoint, if we're going to be correct. So yeah, all of that was going into the demonstration system and allowing us to do this ongoing analysis. So for the purpose of this walkthrough, the kind of thesis that we're going with is if you're in a real world situation and you've got various different instances in the cloud, it could be AWS, you've got a cluster somewhere, there's all kinds of different things as you all well know. But typically they're accessed using SSH. So nice secure shell, great way to connect, certificates, logons, all of these different approaches. But for most organizations, do you actually track and monitor how that happens? Because it's happening quite a lot if you have cloud stuff. And this, of course, you could replace cloud instances with just servers within your organization. But for this scenario, we're looking at cloud instances. Now, one of the things that Corelight is able to do is we can actually look at SSH connections. Now, obviously, you can't see the content of those because by definition, they're secure, they're encrypted. But of course, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens both at the network level in terms of the packets themselves and the information they contain, but especially when you initiate those connections and you're exchanging certificates, you're using those that PKI to actually link the two different devices and have that encrypted stream between the kind of the user and the server or the cloud instance that they're actually connected to. Now, what we're looking at here on the screen is how we take that information and we present it back as a series of inferences. Now, those inferences, I mean, I appreciate there's just a bunch of three-letter acronyms there, but we can run through some of them and the insights that they give you. So IPWA, for example, is interactive password authentication. So that's where somebody is actually logged on by typing in their username and password and making the connection that way. Whereas the alternative PKA is public key authentication. So they've used a certificate to actually connect directly rather than a username and password, which is, of course, the preferred route. There's other information in there. CTS is client trust server. So we know that for those connections, the client already had a reference in their table to say, hey, yeah, we know this server, we've got the certificate, we can just connect in straight away and away we go. Whereas CUS is the opposite. It's a client untrusted server. So that's where it's a first connection and we haven't exchanged certificates. And so it's not in the table of existing connections. So again, an indicator there. And then there's some other useful bits and pieces. SFU is small file upload. LFD is large file download, as you can see at the bottom. And KS is keystrokes. So KS is a really interesting one because it's an interactive session. It's where we can identify immediately that somebody is actually sat and is typing interactively on a keyboard. So we know that it's not a machine-to-machine connection. So all of these pieces of information give you really interesting insights. And if you know that nobody should be having an interactive session to the particular device that we're looking at, then that can be something of concern. That's something that you need to drill into and that you need to work through. Now, traditionally, the way that that would work could potentially be a bit of a challenge. So you would start, and in this case, it's really important to indicate that we are not doing this within our normal SIEM. This is all being done within the Cribl search, as George was talking about earlier. So we sent everything into Cribl, and then, as George highlighted, all of that can go on and be utilized within the SIEM as well. But for this scenario, we can just effectively search within the Cribl search utility, and because we have everything there, we have all of that information, and it can often be quicker and easier because we've done the work within Cribl. So at this point, we're just doing a very straightforward search. We're asking for where the responding port is port 22. So that tells us immediately we're looking at the servers that have been connected to, because we're looking for the responder. And obviously port 22 is SSH, so pretty quick. And for the purposes of this, we've limited it to 1,000 records because potentially it could be a lot more. There could be obviously other limitations you could keep it to, but just for the purposes of this demo, there we go. So this first box that's popped up, that's showing us some of the things like certificates, all of that information that we were talking about earlier. So just to step aside for one moment, this is the kind of thing that's just generally very useful information. So we can understand, for example, from this data that the cipher potentially is a weak cipher that shouldn't be used anymore. We could look at certificates and we could find out that they are almost going out of date or they're already out of date. So there's all kinds of information that we can get from these initial headers. But what we're looking for at this point, having done an investigation, having seen this kind of keystroke traffic that we're slightly concerned about, we're after this UID. So the UID is a unique identifier that's used by Corelight, and it's used to connect all of the different traffic in a network stream. So when a connection is made to the sensor, to the server, there's a lot of information within that connection that Correlight's able to analyze. There's obviously, there's the SSH connection itself, but there could be other aspects around that that's associated with it. First and foremost is the Corelight con log. So that contains all of the information about the connection itself and how it was made, and can contain other information like the file transfer. So if an SFTP connection is launched within the shell, all of that kind of stuff. But it's just a really useful way of saying, hey, this is all part of the same connection, all part of the same conversation, and is all interlinked. Well, that's really useful from the Corelight point of view. So we can go off and we can say, okay, we would like to understand all of the different connections that have taken place using that unique ID. So again, very straightforward search within Cribl search, just using the unique ID and pointing it towards our particular data set. And then we pull out some information. We dig down into the logs, and we start to look for the pieces that we are trying to investigate as part of this. Now, one of the things that we've brought back there is the community ID. You might say, okay, we were just dealing with the UID. That's a Corelight function. What's the community ID? Well, the community ID is another calculated hash, and it was open sourced by Corelight some time ago. And it's really just a calculated hash based on the IP address to and from, the port numbers, and a couple of other bits and pieces of information. But it's a great way of tying together pieces of data from different sources. So obviously you need those IP addresses, you need the port numbers, but they're the kind of things that also exist on the endpoint as well. But vendors don't necessarily use the community ID. There is one endpoint vendor that does, but most others don't. Now, this is where Cribl comes into play as being really powerful. Because we're using Sysmon and we're using Windows event logs, we're not going to have that community ID. That's not a piece of information that's provided within those logs. However, what we can do is we can use Cribl. We can take that information in Cribl, and as part of the pipeline that George was talking about earlier, we can calculate the community ID for the endpoint data. This is very straightforward. The code is published on GitHub by Corelight, so you can easily take it, incorporate it into the Cribl pipeline, and away we go. On every connection that we see from Sysmon, we're able to add that community ID. So then what this means is when we're doing our search, we now search across all of our data sets because we're not just looking at the Corelight data set, we're also looking at the endpoint data set. We pull out that community ID, search for that, and immediately we get back 2 logs. Now, I know that the top one immediately is a Corelight one because it tells me that the path is the con log, and that's always the first field that you would see in any Corelight log is which path we're talking about, or which log type, to put it another way. We get some further information, but I also know that the next one down is not a Corelight log. Because it's not in the right format. So as you can see there, it's actually a Sysmon log. So immediately, just purely by searching on that community ID within Cribl search, we've brought back the matching network data and endpoint data. So we've been able to connect the two very smoothly, very quickly, and bring them both together. So in terms of a kind of a so what does that really mean? Well, in this scenario, there's kind of 3 aspects here. We look into that Sysmon log and we get a whole bunch of information that we would not have been able to find purely with the Corelight data and would not have been easy to find, if at all, by looking separately within the Sysmon. I mean, potentially with a lot of pivoting and a lot of matching up IP addresses and lots of matching up the time differences, you could have connected the 2 together and you could have found this information. But being able to do it in a matter of seconds, because that community ID is already being calculated by Cribl, is incredibly valuable. So as you can see on the left there, we've immediately pulled out the domain and the username. So we know what user it was that was actually logging on with this interactive session. We can actually see that, yep, it's a perfectly ordinary SSH, as we would expect, just a normal executable. And we've got the process ID, so we can use that if we wanted to dig further into the endpoint data. But for those of you that are used to doing threat hunts or analyzing alerts and things like that, you'll know that one of the things that can be really indicative of an attack is a strange application name, or it's missing a process ID. All of these indicators that show that there's something bad going on. So yes, you could of course enhance your searches for matching community IDs where there's no process ID. So there's all kinds of things that you can do. Those of you that are analysts know all of this and the kind of things you can search for. But in terms of the power that this gives us, that ability to immediately link network data and endpoint data is incredibly powerful, and that's down to the ability of Cribl to calculate this on the fly as those streams go through. Now, again, we've done this using Sysmon, but that easily could be done with one of the endpoint tools. They contain the same information. Because of Cribl's normalizing and bringing it all together, it's very easy to calculate that community ID and bring those two into one place. So, George, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Well, Matt, you represented it very well. I think what you represented says it all. I just want to reiterate on two things. One is this community ID that we provided is actually something that we basically did based on the work that Corelight has done, and it's included in the pack. So this code is very simple actually to use in our pack, in our Corelight pack on Cribl, by just running a single function, which is Cribl.community ID. And the second thing, which you said it before also, is the fact that we can apply this into any endpoint data source, regardless of the agent or how we're collecting the data. And also, customers don't have to go back and do this if there are any changes either on the endpoint data or on the analytics solution or SIEM solution that they're using today.
Fantastic. Thanks, George. Yeah, that's a really important point. We haven't spoken about that too much, but yes, the ability to have Cribl in the middle and to be able to swap out different components, whether it's to move to a different endpoint. I know certainly one of the things I've seen Cribl being used for extensively is joining acquisitions, where technologies don't match, and you can almost immediately bring together different data sources and smooth everything out and really work much more cleanly with disparate data. So yeah, really good point. Thanks, George. George, I'll let you cover this slide off.
Yeah, just when we finish, obviously, as we mentioned, we're going to share the the collateral and information around the different things that we talked about for Cribl and Corelight, specifically a joint solution brief that we've done with Corelight. We're going to share that. Obviously, the pack. There is a blog post that is very technical in the details about the pack and how to use it, which is ready-made already by us. And then, obviously, I think you have a device or a sensor from Corelight, right, Matt, that we can that anyone can leverage today to actually test this even at home, along with Cribl Cloud, that you can sign up for a 1 terabyte per day, license that we provision on our cloud free of charge.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is brilliant for those of you that want to try this. The only requirement is you need a Raspberry Pi. If you search online for Corelight at home, you'll find how to kind of apply for it. And then yeah, we'll give you it's actually a full software center. So it has full functionality. The only thing is you will have to, because of the licensing requirements, it will have to come from a work email address. You can't use a Gmail or a Yahoo. It is underwritten by your employer. So just be aware of that. But then, yeah, brilliant. You can add that with the Cribl Cloud, as George mentioned. You can have the data from Corelight going into Cribl Cloud. You can fully understand everything that Cribl can do in terms of ingesting and manipulating that data. And yeah, it's a really, really fun thing to do, actually. So cool. I mean, obviously, you know how to get in touch with Corelight or Cribl. We work together very, very closely, so we can join up at both sides. So go to whoever you are better connected with. That's not a problem, and we can connect you and make sure that that we get everything sorted out. So I think at this stage, Virginie, it's back over to you, and whether there's any questions.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Thank you, George, for this great webinar. I can see some question. If you still have some question, please use the question button, and I will ask them. I have one. Can we use the Corelight Cribl pack for other SIEMs technologies such as CrowdStrike, Logscale, or Exabeam?
Yeah, actually, the pack is designed to be used for specific SIEM solutions, or it's designed out of the box to be used by specific SIEM solutions that I mentioned before. But obviously, if you have Exabeam or a CrowdStrike, Logscale, or any other solution, you can tweak. All what you need to do is actually tweak some of the functions to basically massage the data and put it in a format that this SIEM solution will accept it. It's not a big job. It's actually a GUI-based pipeline technology, as you probably seen a little bit. You can experience that, and you can change it to fit any SIEM technology.
All right. I've got a question, so I'm going to read it. Sorry, I need to make it bigger. Under TLS 1.3, the certificate exchange is encrypted as well. What kind of metadata can Corelight extract from that? Or more general, what kind of information can Corelight extract from TLS 1.3 traffic at all?
Yeah, so that's a good one. We actually covered that in another webinar that we did last month. So that might be worth looking into, where we specifically spoke about the Shake the Box was the name of the webinar. And we actually talk about everything with encrypted traffic. Yeah, it's absolutely right. The number of steps involved with TLS 1.3 has dropped significantly. I think it's gone from 7 to 3. So yes, there isn't quite as much back and forth. But ultimately, the same information is still exchanged. It's just more efficiently exchanged, and it allows for less disruption to those steps. But in terms of what we actually pull out, it's not hugely deficient. You still need to have those same steps of the very nature of PKI means that you have to exchange certificates. Doing it more efficiently is great, and it's clearly more secure, and that's good. But it hasn't had a huge impact, if anything, in terms of the inferences and how it works, because we're not just looking at that exchange metadata. There is more involved with the processes. It's a similar kind of thing as to how everybody sort of panicked when HTTPS became an issue. Going off track a little bit, encrypted DNS is probably more of a concern because DNS is obviously a hugely important tool for analysts to understand where people are going. But yeah, TLS 1.3, we know about it. It's cool. Yeah, it doesn't really, from an analyst point of view, and the information that we pull out and the insights that you get, it really hasn't made a difference.
Another question, do logs re-ingested through Cribl replay generate additional license cost in Cribl or only at the destination?
Yeah, that's a good question. So actually, when we replay the data, we're not going to count it back again towards the license, because the data, we have ingested it once. So we just count towards the license once as it comes in. So think about it as data came in, it went, Corelight data came in, we sent a copy into Elastic or Splunk, and then basically we sent another copy into an object storage. When we want to replay it back, we're not going to count it neither when we replay it back into Cribl or through Cribl, or when we ingest it back into a SIEM solution.
Okay. Another question. I see that there is a Zeek integration for Elastic. Do Corelight / Cribl have planned for integrations too?
Sorry, can
yes,
you repeat? Is it on Z? No, sorry, go ahead, Matt.
No, I was just, I mean, yeah, hopefully this will give you, because I think probably half of this will need to come from you, George. Yes,
Yeah.
you can absolutely integrate directly from Corelight into Elastic. We can do that direct, although the preferred approach is via Logstash. But there are significant benefits that Cribl can bring, and yes, those integrations do already exist. So you can absolutely go from Corelight to Cribl to Elastic and get the same benefits, if not more, actually, because one of the big things I do know with Elastic is the Elastic Common Schema. Now, doing that kind of transition from the traditional Zeek formatting, so that just to give clarity, that's where Microsoft have changed their common schema to match Zeek's, but Elastic uses a different common schema. So if you want to go from Corelight into Elastic and you want to use their common schema and not use a Zeek schema, then Cribl is a fantastic way to deal with all of that. But George, I'll let you continue.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the pack, which we're going to share after, basically, we can take the data and normalize, right? We talked about enriching before, we talked about like reduction and so on, but normalization is actually a big thing, right? So the Elastic Common Schema is something that is supported out of the box. Any other schema is supported really, but when we talk about the pack, we're talking about like out of the box capability to basically normalize the data into the Elastic Common Schema.
Another question: does the Cribl pack for CrowdStrike allow for the creation of the community ID for that endpoint data?
That's actually a good question. So today we have a pack for Corelight. It actually doesn't do it out of the box, but anything that we've seen here for the Windows collected data through WEF directly or through Cribl Edge can be replicated and basically done the same. So we can reuse the pack if you want, or the logic of the pack, on the Corelight, on the CrowdStrike data and do it accordingly. That's not an issue at all.
Okay. Do you want to take another question? Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. If it's for me, all good. Still have 2 minutes.
Okay, so 2 more questions. Which data stores does Cribl search support?
Yeah, it's a very good question, actually. So we support today multiple data lakes and object stores. Like, for example, of course, Amazon S3, Azure Blob Storage, Google Cloud Storage. We support also the new Amazon Security Data Lake. And then we support also, collecting or searching actually data from different API based endpoints like Azure, like Google Workspace, Microsoft Graph API, Tailscale, etc., etc. Very good question. And note one thing also that we didn't talk about, which is if we have Edge installed on the endpoints, we can also search this data while it is on the Edge on the server itself. So there is a broad support, and we're of course adding more on the go for Cribl search support.
All right, I'm going to do last question then. Are there other ways I could use Cribl pipeline to help with manipulating Corelight data before putting it into my SIEM?
There are other ways. I mean, I don't know the details about which ways, but basically, just to explain quickly, we can collect on the collection side from Corelight. We can collect through different ways, whether it is TCP JSON as we saw, or through syslog, or HTTP event collector. When we get this data in, we can parse this data automatically through the pack, and then yes, we can apply any function in Cribl to actually tweak this app if you want, or this pack, and apply any kind of use case that we have. The use case or the pack supports specifically reductions through maybe dropping and aggregation and so on, but we can extend it easily with other functions to clean the data more, transform the data, and basically use other formats if we want, and so on. Any function, long story short, any function available on Cribl for any type of log data, we can leverage it inside the pack or outside the pack for Corelight data.
Yeah, and
Right.
I'll just add there's some really useful things that you can do there, because not only does it allow you to shift processing from the Zeek sensor, but writing stuff for Zeek and the scripting within Zeek, some of it's fairly straightforward, but a lot of it you do need to have a reasonable depth of knowledge. Cribl simplifies that process significantly, so it can be much more effective. It reduces load from the sensors, and again, it allows you to combine data sources. So yeah, there's a lot that you can do in Cribl that really enhances Corelight data before it makes its way into the SIEM and your analysts actually get to see it.
All right. Well, Matt, George, thank you very much for this webinar. We will be following up with an email with a recording and some extra assets for you. And please reach out to our teams, Cribl or Corelight, if you have any further question. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you.